Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole, and this week we're looking at what the COVID-19 pandemic has meant for the gap between men and women. One report suggests COVID means it'll now be an extra 36 years, an entire generation, before we reach true equality. Paying the price? Will men and women get the same salaries for the same jobs? And we'll be finding out why working mums have been hit the hardest by lockdown. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world as we know it. Globally, there are few who haven't felt its impact. And perhaps inevitably, it's been far worse for women than for men. According to the World Economic Forum's annual Global Gender Gap Report, the pandemic has meant women must wait an extra 36 years to close that gap, meaning another whole generation will miss out. While there's been progress in closing the gap between men and women in education and health outcomes, the pandemic has increased economic hurdles, seen political participation decline, and especially created new problems at work. Indeed, in the last year, women have been losing jobs at a far higher rate, 5%, as opposed to just 3.9% for men. Why? Well, it's largely down to the sectors which have been hit particularly hard by COVID. For example, women, especially younger women and working mothers, are represented at a disproportionately high level in the hospitality and retail sectors. One study has suggested that in the UK alone, working mums are nearly 50% more likely than fathers to have lost their jobs or had to quit since the pandemic hit. That same study found that mothers combine paid work with other activities, usually childcare, in 47% of their work hours, compared to just 30% for fathers. And it's that which may have been the biggest problem caused by COVID. As nurseries, schools and other care establishments closed, it's been the mothers left to pick up the pieces. The US Census Bureau, for example, says there were 1.5 million fewer mothers in employment in March 2021 than a year earlier. And where schools have reopened, those women have found it increasingly hard to find new work. Data from employment social media site LinkedIn suggests women are now being hired at a slower rate in many industries and also less likely to be hired for leadership roles. Let's speak now to one of the people behind the World Economic Forum's gender report, the head of Inclusive Economies Practice at the Centre for the New Economy and Society, Till Leopold. Till, your annual gender gap report makes for pretty grim reading. Why has it been so devastating for women?
Indeed, we find that the time needed to close the global gender gap has increased by a generation from 99 years to 135 years. And this is because while COVID-19 has, of course, affected the livelihoods of many people very significantly, it is fair to say from all the data that it has disproportionately affected women. And if you only look at the economic dimension alone, of course, as many people were confined to their homes, a disproportionate amount of the sort of homework and care work responsibility has been shouldered by women, but women also have been working before the pandemic, particularly in the sectors that are most affected by the pandemic, such as retail, such as hospitality. So these are some of the factors.
And do you think the growing gap is down entirely to the pandemic, or what other factors are involved?
No, so our Global Gender Gap Report has been measuring the progress toward gender parity for more than a decade now. And in fact, we're looking at gender gaps across 4 dimensions: the economic dimension, education, health, and political empowerment. And while we see this particularly severe reversal this year, actually in some ways this is unfortunately a continuation of some wider trends that we have been observing from a number of years now. And to some extent, this is in particular, we leave the pandemic aside for a moment, because while there has been a lot of progress on women's empowerment in the area of education and of health, but a lot of that sort of investment in women has not actually translated into really giving women having equal opportunity in the economic sphere. And so this is a trend that sort of has been worrying us for a number of years, and too many countries continue to waste a lot of women's talent.
And how did you calculate an extra 36 years on the gender divide?
Yeah, so this number is something that we calculate every year. And we basically calculate at the current rate of progress globally, how long it would take to close the global gender gap. And so this number is likely to change every year, and this is quite intentional. We want to highlight that the move towards gender parity is really about the investments and the things that we do here and now, and this is not a fate, and we can do something about it right now. So this is how we calculate it.
And it wasn't all bad news, was it? Because there were some positives. I'm looking in particular at education and health, and the gaps are nearly closed there, aren't they? So that is progress.
Yeah, indeed. So many countries have successfully improved women's access to health, women's access to education. And so we have seen a lot of progress on women's educational attainment among younger generations of women globally in particular. So this is very positive. And it is the result of both investment in these areas, but also really of the determination of women themselves to make progress in these areas. However, as I already mentioned as well, so a lot of that educational access has actually not really translated yet into progress on the economy. So this is worrying. And also even in education, we continue to see some gender gaps, for example, in some of the fields of study that are particularly relevant for the future, such as science and technology.
And you've also published a list of top 10 gender favourable countries. Iceland, once again, the most gender equal country in the world. But the top 10 also includes countries like Rwanda and Lithuania. What are those countries doing right that the other countries aren't?
Yeah, it is important to understand that our research doesn't actually look at sort of absolute levels of wealth, for example, but we're simply looking at the gap in opportunities between countries. And when we do that, the picture that emerges here is clear. It's not that gender parity is some sort of luxury that rich countries can afford and others can't, but actually at any level of economic development of the country, gender parity itself is actually one of the best investments for progress in all of these other areas. And so, for example, in a country like Rwanda, we actually see that investment in greater progress in women's equality has actually translated into progress in these other areas. Or in a country like Lithuania, for example, we see that there's been a lot of progress on women's political participation. So there is really a lot that you can do at any level of sort of economic development of your country, if you will.
So good signs of progress, in other words. What about the countries you think that need to do most work to catch up and bridge the divide?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that no country has yet fully closed this global gender gap. All countries have more work to do. But what we see are particular patterns emerging around the world. So for example, in countries in the Middle East and North Africa, so these have obviously among the largest gender gaps in political participation, but they're also the region with some of the fastest progress in this area. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we see that actually these countries are doing quite well on women's economic empowerment, but there is yet more to do on education. And in many high-income economies, such as in Europe and elsewhere, gender gaps continue to exist in women's leadership positions and in sort of in the broader participation in the upper echelons of the economy. So I think there's sort of a regional puzzle, essentially, that needs to be solved in different ways all over the world.
Do the world's governments take gender equality, do you think, seriously enough?
I think we are seeing encouraging signs that gender equality is increasingly being taken seriously. However, given everything else that's going on in the world right now, I think it's important to ensure that gender parity really stays at the top of the agenda. And that's a problem as well, isn't it? Because they may be taking it seriously, but soon as something like a pandemic comes along, they seem to revert to old practices again. Yeah, that is very worrying. But I think to some extent, however, we've also seen kind of the inspiring example of the opposite, which is we've seen how strong political leadership by women prime ministers and women heads of state has actually shepherded many countries really well through the pandemic and with markedly better outcomes than other countries. So I think we have a really strong sort of example of another course that the country can chart here as well. Yeah, some women leaders have famously, globally, led the way in bridging that gender divide. But nevertheless, one of the fastest gender gaps is politics, where the report suggests it'll take over 145 years to close that gap, up more than 50% from 95 years in last year's report. Why is that? Yeah, it is I think it is hard to put a single explanation on this, and it is indeed very worrying because political empowerment in general has been one of the areas where we have seen a lot of progress around the world, although from a low base. If I had to speculate, I think it is because COVID has obviously put a halt to a lot of public life, and so it also has made sort of women's participation in public life that would be conducive to politics a lot harder. So I do hope that this particular trend is a blip and not a trend, because we have seen a lot of progress on political empowerment.
Do you think this widening, lastly, Till, do you think this widening of the gender gap is a blip or a worrying longer-term trend?
Yeah, so as I already mentioned, I think there are some signs that this is more than a blip. So we've seen sort of some of reversals of positive trends for a number of years now. But I think what we need to keep in mind is that investment in closing gender gaps really have really large economic and societal payoffs. So they're themselves one of the best strategies to move the world forward out of the pandemic. So concerted investment in this area is really something that we should look at for the benefit of everyone, not just for women alone.
Indeed. Till Leopold of the World Economic Forum, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you so much.
Still to come here on The Agenda, the female approach. Have women world leaders really dealt with the pandemic better than their male counterparts? Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The Agenda. Of course, equal pay has been one of the key battlegrounds in the fight to close the gender gap. The latest statistics suggest that this year, on average, women will earn 82 cents for every dollar earned by a man. So how can we end that discrepancy, and what effect has the pandemic had on that particular issue? Joining me with their thoughts are Wanda Wyporska from the Equality Trust and Rachel Verdin, Research Fellow at the University of Sussex. We've heard earlier in the programme of a report which suggests the pandemic has pushed gender parity back a generation. Rachel, is that a sort of timescale you would agree with?
I think it's important to first think about what the pandemic has done, and that is to really kind of pull back the veneer on the inequalities that are already bubbling away. You mentioned there the gender pay gap, which is very much still rife, and we know that women still take on by far the majority of caring and domestic responsibilities in the home, and what COVID has done is really kind of amplify those challenges and brought them to the fore. But I do think it's perhaps a little simplistic to talk kind of in generational terms. I think there's a bit more nuance needed. If you think about sort of 30, 40 years ago, the Equal Value Amendment was just being passed. Women's engagement in the workplace and in political life and levels of educational qualification have really ramped up since then. And there's been a whole raft of legislation that's been passed. And I don't kind of see a mass exodus of women or perhaps, legislation being repealed. But I do think that risk is perhaps more likely in terms of those gains perhaps being undermined. We've seen during COVID a real lack of focus on women and women's needs in policy planning, and I think the risk of those gains and equality gains being disregarded and not prioritised is really what I think is perhaps more of a risk at the moment. So there's a real need for a gender agenda to ensure that the pay gap does keep closing, but we also need to be addressing the very, very slow rate of closure of that pay gap, which needs, again, greater focus at kind of a policy and government level.
And Wanda, Wyporska, you've been working on the fight for equal pay for some time. Would you agree with Rachel on that one?
Yes, absolutely. And I think what we need to look at is not just the gender pay gap, as Rachel was referring to, but the other issues in terms of childcare, in terms of the types of jobs that are being created, and the UK's government focus on a construction and infrastructure rebuilding rather than an economy of care, which would actually provide far more jobs and far more for the economy. But we also have to think about what you mentioned in the first place, which was the issue of equal pay, which is the fact that, unfortunately, we still have a lot of women who aren't being paid the same as men for work of the same value or for the same jobs. And that's something that's very much hidden, because in order to find that out, women need to know just what their male counterparts are being paid. And so that's a separate issue, but an equally valid one.
And Rachel, why do you think the pandemic has been so difficult for women in particular? One report I've seen suggests job openings for women dropped by more than 40% compared to just over 10% for men.
Obviously men and women do different kinds of jobs, and that's been a key element really, because we know that women have been more likely to work in shut down sectors. They're more prominent in areas like hospitality or retail or tourism, and those areas have been really hit hardest by national lockdowns. And when you combine that with the fact that women are also more likely to be key workers, there have been increased needs as a result of home school requirements, increased care needs for relatives as well. And we've seen that women have been far more likely to leave jobs or take reduced hours to meet those care needs. We mentioned there that the gender pay gap. So when families are kind of making a decision about who takes those reduced hours, then that, a vicious cycle essentially occurs.
Wanda, countries with large inequalities between genders have lots of other problems too, don't they? Worse mental health, more violent crime and so on. So why do you think that is?
Well, we know that in terms of income inequality, and obviously the gender pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap, the disability pay gap, and here in the UK, the class pay gap, all contribute to that and are all different manifestations of that. But we know that in countries with high levels of income inequality, such as the UK, such as the US, we also see higher levels of poor mental health, poor physical health, drug and alcohol addiction, violent crime, incarceration. We see lower levels of educational attainment, lower levels of trust, which of course is essential in a democracy and in time of a pandemic. So the wider impacts are much broader than just what's in people's pay packets. It also determines those issues around health. And if COVID has shown us anything, it's that health is deeply, deeply linked to our living and material standards. So we've seen, particularly here in the UK, but worldwide, that the pandemic has hit hardest in areas of deprivation.
And to help recognise those inequalities, should all companies around the world publish gender pay figures?
Well, I think that would be a great start. But what I think is equally important is that companies have transparency around pay, and that affects discrimination, it affects promotion, it allows people to see where the pay bands are, and to have a transparent structure would bring a lot more equality into our workplaces, as well as, for example, showing the salary when you're advertising jobs. We know that one of the drivers of inequality is to have those different pay bands and different pay settings. So, for example, if I go for a job and I'm asked what my former salary was, against a man whose salary probably would be higher because of labour market discrimination, then that company is perpetuating those labour market gaps. So we would say to everybody, yes, show your salaries, have transparent salary bands, and publish your pay gaps.
And Rachel, how is it, do you think, we're still having to have this conversation? What needs to be done now going forward to bridge this gender gap?
Yeah, I mean, it's been over 50 years in the UK since the Equal Pay Act was passed, and, longer since those provisions across Europe. Change has been glacially slow. the norms and kind of values and cultures that need changing are deeply embedded. And I think greater transparency is really critically important. I know that the EU published a proposed directive in March of this year, where they're looking at greater transparency measures. So beyond just pay reporting, but thinking about salary history banning. So I also think the question of flexibility is really important. The idea around flexibility at work has been kind of bounced around for years now, but yet COVID has really proven that, quite inadvertently, but proven that it's possible, and that can be a real game changer. But that needs to not just be flexibility for women, it needs to also be flexibility for men, because we've seen that when men apply for flexibility, they're more likely to be turned down, and we know that they apply a lot less, and that kind of reflects those very deeply embedded values around care in society. So I think embedding flexibility, ensuring that jobs are all advertised on a flexible basis, and improving transparency are two really critical areas where developments could be made.
And Wanda, perhaps post-pandemic, there could be a reset. Can that work to perhaps reset gender equality?
Well, I'd like to think so, but unfortunately, history tells us otherwise. I think we may see some small incremental gains in terms of individual practice and organisations, but I think, as Rachel said, this is about a bigger issue. It's about childcare, it's about caring responsibilities, it's about how we see, coming back to the stereotypes we were talking about, how we see the role of men and women, how we see this occupational segregation that we have, where women are more likely to go into some roles and less likely to go into others. And also women more likely to go into part-time roles because of caring responsibilities. So, if we were to have this reset, it would have to be fundamental. It would have to quite literally be from the cradle upwards. And I'm not confident that society is actually going to do that at this stage.
Wanda Wyporska from the Equality Trust and Rachel Verdin from the University of Sussex Business School. Many thanks to you both for joining us on the agenda. So while many female workers have struggled through the pandemic, a number of female leaders have certainly proved their worth, notably New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern, whose handling of COVID-19 has attracted praise from all around the world. So are women showing themselves to be better leaders in a crisis? Here with me now is Professor Kate McLean from the Centre for International Development at Northumbria University. Kate, your recent article suggests that in general, female leaders have dealt with the COVID pandemic in a better way than their male counterparts. So give me some evidence to support that.
This is a time when feminine skills have really come to the fore. What we've seen across the world is a pattern of women leaders who appear to have handled the pandemic very well by listening to the experts, having clear communication, and adopting a collaborative bottom-up approach to governance. And that's been placed in sharp relief by more maverick leaders who have been leading the countries that have really not fared so well during the pandemic. So, for example, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the United States, and more recently we're seeing that Modi's approach in India has not been as effective as that of female leaders.
Can you sort of just narrow it down for Jacinda Ardern and perhaps Angela Merkel too, despite the problems in Europe with the vaccine rollout? Can you give me some specifics about how they have performed better than their male counterparts?
I think the starting point there is they both listen to the experts, and that's a trait that is associated with feminine leadership. That's a trait of collaboration, of listening, but without losing sight of the fact that it's still your responsibility to make the call. Yeah? So both Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel listened to the experts, they locked down early, even though that possibly wasn't popular at the time, but they adopted very clear, convincing communication strategies. It's striking that Angela Merkel, who is known as the mummy of the nation in Germany, but her background as a scientist came to the fore as being really valuable during the management of this pandemic. And the collaborative approach that was taken with teams of scientists, not only in epidemiology, but also in psychology, in economy, that they were brought together.
The traits you mentioned from Jacinda Ardern and Mutti, Angela Merkel, aren't they stereotypically feminine? Collaborative, listening, empathy. I mean, were those the reasons for their success, or was it more to do with what you mentioned with Merkel, that she had a scientific background? And it's very, very rare, male or female, of leaders around the world to have scientific backgrounds.
That's an essential point. I think a concern that's coming out of the debate around women leaders is that those stereotypical traits are being reinforced, and perhaps we're overlooking that what really counts is the fact that they've come from an institutional setting, a political culture which values feminine traits. So the things that countries that have been led by women have in common is that the political systems, the institutions of governance allow women to come to the fore because those skills are valued. In those situations, collaboration is more valued, solidarity is more valued over competition. And that's really what has made countries like New Zealand, Germany, Finland, that's what sets them apart. And therefore, they have more women leaders because feminine traits are valued.
Do you think the COVID crisis will make it easier for women to rise to the top in politics? Has it had a political impact?
I very much hope so. The molds have begun to break, I think, and the ideas we have of leadership are changing all the time. COVID has allowed feminine traits, the importance of collaboration, of listening, of empathy. They've been praised internationally as qualities of leadership. So I think there has been a step change in the way that the world sees leaderships and the leadership and the characteristics that we value in leaders. I would strike a note of caution that historically there's a pattern that women leaders do come to the fore in crises. It's almost like mum catching the ball and clearing up the mess kind of thing. And what tends to happen, we saw that in the financial crisis, for example, like there was suddenly a desire for more women leaders. But what tends to happen is when there's some kind of normality or stability has come back, there tends to be a reversion to more traditional styles of leadership. And I hope that during the COVID pandemic, feminine skills, not only in leadership, but as you mentioned in your introduction, the importance of care, the importance of the social infrastructure, the work that women do across the economy and society is going to be more valued because it's been very clear that they're extremely needed.
Professor Kate McLean from Northumbria University, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you very much.
The last year has had a massive impact on many women's lives around the world as the pandemic increased existing inequalities. The United Nations and other international organizations have warned that many hard-won rights have not just been lost, but could take many years to recover. Here in the UK, lockdowns and restrictions placed a heavy burden on women, especially working mothers. Not only have there been job losses, but issues surrounding childcare and domestic responsibilities have intensified during lockdowns and school closures. And worse still, as our guests have made very clear, the gender pay gap is stubbornly high, especially among the highest paid categories of employment. Pay and progression prospects for female part-time workers remain much lower than for full-timers, and there are also signs they suffered particularly badly from job losses in 2020. That's why investment is so badly needed to correct the many imbalances which the pandemic has either revealed or exacerbated. Now, without such investment, there is a real danger that the gains made to date in equalising young women's life chances will be lost. Meanwhile, continued pay squeezes in the public sector have a depressive effect on women's pay overall, including for the nurses and the other health professionals on whom we all depend. Don't forget you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future agenda, costing the Earth, why the private sector needs to do more to help save the planet. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.